Hello, my name is Loren Ghiglione, and I'm an emeritus professor at Northwestern University, former dean of the university's Medill School of Journalism, and as my shirt shows, a fan of Mark Twain. In 2011, as a 70th birthday present to myself, I undertook a 14,000-mile, 3-month, 28-state drive around America to accomplish three things. First, research countrywide the history of the Ghigliones, as rare in America as feathers on a fish. Second, interview Americans in all their diversity about race, sexual orientation, immigration status, and other hot-button identity issues. And third, follow the path, both the intellectual path and the real path by around America of Mark Twain. Twain wrote, "There ain't no surer way to find out whether you like people or hate them than to travel with them. I really liked my traveling companions, Alyssa and Dan Tham, who taught me as much as I taught them during the trip." Alyssa, who had just graduated from Northwestern University Journalism School, had rejected immediately pursuing a prestigious journalism job, the goal of many graduates, especially like those like Alyssa, who were burdened with a large student loan debt. Instead, Alyssa worked 70 to 80 hours a week as our trip's well below minimum wage everything: navigator, travel agent, copy editor, tech specialist, photographer. She took most of the photos we're showing you, and Advil dispenser. Her merry mischievous motto is, "Everything is a good time or a good story." Today, Alyssa is Associate Director of Audience Development at Vanity Fair. Dan Tham, a junior, who was taking the trip as a one-credit course, joined Alyssa and me 2 days into our odyssey. He was returning from internships abroad that reflected his interest in reporting on people sometimes cast as the world's outliers. Credit his upbringing. He recalled his time in white bread, heavily Mormon Salt Lake City as a quadruple minority: Asian, gay, Buddhist, and vegetarian. While Dan achieved in the way most journalism students wanted to achieve, as a senior he would win Northwestern's top broadcast journalism award, he also explored what it means to be an outlier. For a course on Chicago's immigrant and multi-ethnic communities, at one point he found himself in the middle of a protest for Tibetan freedom outside the Chinese embassy. Today, Dan, who was our trip's videographer, is a producer for CNN in Hong Kong. Alyssa, Dan, and I interviewed 150 Americans during our cross-country trip, which, as I said, loosely followed Twain's travel route. Twain, whose father died when he was 11, stopped attending school. He started apprenticing at local newspapers, and at 17, traveling as a printer's assistant to work in St. Louis, New York City, Philadelphia. To those cities, we added detours to other Twain locations: Washington, D.C., New Haven, Hartford, and Boston. At 19 and 20, Twain helped his brother Orion put out papers in Keokuk and Muscatine, Iowa. Here's the Twain who resided in Muscatine during our 2011 trip. Then we headed south and west. Twain became a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi between St. Louis and New Orleans until the Civil War began. At 25, he and his brother Orion traveled from St. Joe, Missouri to Nevada and San Francisco, where Twain became a reporter. We ended our trip in Seattle, the last major stop in the United States before Twain, in his 60s, undertook a world-circling lecture tour to recover from bankruptcy. In the limited time we have, Alyssa, Dan, and I are going to tell you about a dozen of the diverse people we interviewed, but I hope we may be excused for beginning the presentation with a brief love letter to Elmira. In 2011, as we followed Twain's path around America, Elmira was the first and only stop where we splurged on our lodging. We had been staying in cheap motels like Cleveland's America's Best Value Inn, which a TripAdvisor reviewer rated the filthiest hotel in America. Do not stay here. In Elmira, the Painted Lady, a circa 1875 bed and breakfast, featured a Victorian billiard parlor We imagined Twain shooting around there. And some amazing rooms. Alyssa slept in a room called Becky's Sanctuary. Dan stayed in Olivia's Rose Garden, and I luxuriated in a large room titled Twain's Retreat. Our page lodging was all downhill after Elmira. Second, we ate a fine meal at Charlie's Cafe in Elmira, which led us to establish a travel rule for the rest of our trip. Avoid exit ramp fast food and fast fat chains. Seek out local cafes and diners. Twain would have especially liked Doe's Place, a dilapidated dive we visited in Greenville, Mississippi, that began in 1941 and followed the rules of segregation at the time in reverse, having the neighborhood's Black residents come to the front door and whites to the back. Third, the view from Twain's study at Quarry Farm commands, he said, leagues of valley and city and retreating ranges of distant blue hills. Perhaps the serpentine Chemung River reminded him of the Mississippi. Anyway, it led the three of us to debate the impact of place, big city, small town, Rocky Mountains, on our lives. Dan from Salt Lake City argued the nearby mountains made Salt Lakers value things like fortitude, adventure, the pioneering spirit. Fourth and finally, our time in Elmira made us think yet again about such identity issues as sexual orientation, race, and gender, identity issues that were the impetus of our cross-country trip. The poem on the Woodlawn Cemetery gravesite of Susie Clemens, Samuel Clemens' oldest daughter, who died at age 24, talks of a young lady, quote, never so glad as when you had 20 lovers, man and lad, round you waiting for a glance. But when Susie was a first-year student at Bryn Mawr College, she may have been passionately attached to another female student there. Funding by the United Daughters of the Confederacy for the creation during our time in Elmira of the John W. Jones Museum to honor a runaway slave who served as an Underground Railroad agent and also buried thousands of Confederate soldiers imprisoned in Elmira, prompted a strong reaction from Lucy Brown, the head of the museum. Quote, just don't come with that Confederate flag, she said. Don't come with that flag. And our visit to the Elmira Correctional Facility reminded us of Twain's visits there to lecture in 1886, 1888, and 1895. Twain attributed his success with the 850 reformatory residents, quote, the best audience in the world, to the absence of women. He wrote, no dampening female person was in sight with her heartfelt of emotions and her determined repression, choking it down and keeping signs of it from showing on the outside. So we salute Elmira and its Center for Mark Twain Studies and begin our lecture about our trip by returning to our first stop, our visit to the Mark Twain Birthplace Museum in Stoutsville, Missouri. I conducted the trip's first interview with 61-year-old museum guide Connie Ritter. She recalled as a child never entering the museum. No one ever told us we couldn't go inside, she said, but we knew we couldn't go inside, and now I work here. She said that at the beginning, quote, I hated Mark Twain because of Nigger Jim. She questioned Twain's use of the African-American character in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but she came to understand the novel as an assault on racism. In 2010, she added a slavery display to the museum's exhibit to highlight the role of slavery in the area, which had a large number of plantations, slaves, and lynchings. The display showed, for example, a reproduction ball and chain, a foot-wide, 7 3/4 pound ball attached by a short chain to a slave's ankle that demonstrated how hard it would have been for a slave to escape. When I returned to the museum in 2015, I learned Ritter had retired in December 2014. The museum no longer employed any African Americans. Her slavery display had been taken down, supposedly only for as long as it would take to get proper permission to use the photos in the display. But I recently telephoned the museum. More than 6 years after Ritter's retirement, the slavery display still remains in the museum's basement. A museum spokesperson insisted that the slavery display is, quote, definitely on our list to do. I recalled, however, the words of Isabel Wilkerson, the author of her book, Caste. It is as if the greater the distance we can create between slavery and ourselves, the better to stave off the guilt or shame it induces. After a half dozen interviews in Hannibal, we moved on to St. Louis, where Alyssa had an especially thought-provoking interview. Alyssa?
So in St. Louis, we picked up an alt weekly newspaper and we saw a story about a homeless camp called Hopeville. So we wanted to visit, right? And the first problem was it's a homeless camp, so we didn't have an address beyond north of the arch and next to the river. But sure enough, it was there between the railroad tracks and the Mississippi River flood wall. Tarps, tents, rusty vans, fires, trash cans, dozens of cats. And there was a highway style sign that said, "Welcome to Hopeville," which kind of announced this civilization on the fringe of society. So we do get there and we meet a man and we ask him who we should speak to. And he says, "Oh, you'll want to speak to the mayor, Big Mama." And we're thinking, the mayor, there's a mayor of a homeless camp. And once again, sure enough, there is a mayor and her name is Big Mama. And the three of us sat down in chairs and we had a talk. And she explained Hopeville to us and took us around. And she had such a larger than life personality and was a real delight to talk to. I don't want to gloss over the difficult aspects of life at Hopeville. The residents dealt with violence and addiction. Inclement weather could be life-threatening, but it was an example of a community that had created a support system out of necessity. And she told us, quote, "You come together when it's true or right." And she said the name started out as a joke, Hopeville, but that she really did find hope when she got there. And when I last spoke to Big Mama in 2018, she had found housing and she had reestablished her life. So with that, Loren, I'll kick it back to you to talk about Hal Holbrook.
Thanks, Alyssa. St. Louis was as close as we were going to get during our trip to a performance of Hal Holbrook's legendary Mark Twain Tonight. Alyssa and Dan had never seen Holbrook perform. Thanks to Alyssa's Red Bull-aided 300-mile round trip to Vincennes, Indiana, we not only saw Holbrook perform, but wangled our way into a post-performance reception with Holbrook. He loved the idea of our trip, recommended that we visit Twain's cabin at Jackass Hill in the Sierras, and after a lengthy email exchange, agreed to let me interview him 2 years later at his Hilltop Beverly Hills home. I followed up our 2011 trip with numerous trips from 2012 to 2016 to re-interview people and conduct new interviews. The interview of Holbrook, who died earlier this year at 95, took place in a first-floor library dominated by a 3-by-5-foot painting of Holbrook's third wife, Dixie Carter, who had died of cancer in 2010. Holbrook had spent the morning before our meeting writing about the last days of Carter, quote, "whom I adored above anyone I'd ever met," he said. He was having to reconcile her Christian faith, her belief in God and heaven, with his, quote, "hard-nosed New England upbringing." He grew up questioning, not believing. His family, he said, never went to church. A copy of Toni Morrison's book, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, sat on a small table beside one of Holbrook's favorite chairs. A large Twain research library lived upstairs. The book, based on a series of 3 lectures at Harvard, made clear that Holbrook was a scholar of Twain, not only a gifted actor. As a septuagenarian, I wanted to know why Holbrook, from the time he was 29, chose to portray Twain at age 70. Holbrook explained that Twain, older and bolder at 70, would have said anything by that age the actor wanted to put in his Mark Twain Tonight performances. "I did not want to do anything that was not authentic," Holbrook said, "authentic in every way, including appearance, movement, and voice." While no recording of Twain's voice survives, Holbrook interviewed Twain's assistant, Isabel Lyons, and Twain's only surviving daughter, Clara, before their deaths. Holbrook's drawn-out drawl was convincingly dilatory, but not the speed attributed to Twain by one jocular journalist, 3 words a minute. Holbrook also refused to include topics in his show, however timely, that Twain did not address in his writings or lectures. Holbrook carefully researched Twain's works. I will look for something that seems is important, to be talking about what's going on today, and there's plenty of it. A contemporary event that caught Holbrook's eye was a GQ interview of US Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. The potential presidential candidate answered a question about the Earth's age with a non-answer. I'm not a scientist, man. I think parents should be able to teach their kids what their faith says, what science says. Whether the Earth was created in 7 days or 7 actual eras, I'm not sure we'll ever be able to answer that. It's one of the great mysteries. Holbrook noted that Rubio chose to ignore scientists' conclusion that the Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old. Why couldn't he answer it, Holbrook said? Because he would alienate his base, the Christian right. I don't like that. So Holbrook was putting together a new piece of Twain materials about the Christian Bible. In the middle, Holbrook said, I put this Twain stuff about evolution, just for Mr. Rubio. The subject of lying provoked Holbrook to shout, I get very upset with what I see going on. I can't stand lying. I cannot stand lying. I cannot stand lying. It makes me so angry. He accused politicians campaigning for election and some of the news media covering them of providing just lies, untruth, no facts. Holbrook said he tried to use his Twain performances to get audiences to think about the complicated issues America faces. You're an older actor. Your head is older. Everything going through your brain is older. It's heavier to carry. It's harder to solve. It's more complicated than it was 40 years ago. He laughed. Everything is just a mess, but that's life. Somebody has to make people think, he continued. He looked forward in 3 weeks, he said, to delivering a message in New Albany, Ohio, a place that I know is overrun by Republicans. I came to my interview of Holbrook with some doubts about Twain's views on race. Twain seemed less enlightened about Native Americans, for example, than about African Americans. And when a reporter in Calcutta, India, asked Twain about the future of multiracial relationships, mixed marriages, Twain said, not the slightest. I asked Holbrook how Twain felt about gays and lesbians. To remain authentic, Holbrook avoided the topic of sexual orientation in his performances because Twain failed to address it. You just didn't deal with it, Holbrook said. When I went to school, we did not address it. It was a private thing. So what do I think Mark Twain would feel about these things? What does he feel about anything that had to do with ignorance and a lack of empathy for other people? Holbrook called the message of Twain, whom he described as my school, my teacher, my everything, a cry for questioning. He feared Americans had stopped thinking about race and other tough topics. They've cemented the walls around their point of view, he said, and nobody gets out and nobody can climb in. Holbrook had no thought of retiring. He and his 2 sisters were abandoned by their parents when he was 2. He hungered for approval. But, he said, the thing that gets me up in the morning and allows me to sleep at night is the feeling that I'm doing something that's important to me, that I feel has some importance to other people. I'm not just out there talking to myself. That's for damn sure. After St. Louis, we conducted a dozen interviews in Chicago. Twain's fictional Satan tells a newcomer to hell, the trouble with you Chicago people is that you think you are the best people down here, whereas you are merely the most numerous. Then we moved on to Cleveland. There we were especially moved by an interview, highly relevant today, with Priscilla Cooper. Dan, do you want to talk about that interview?
Sure, Loren. So in Cleveland, we met Priscilla Cooper, who's an African-American anti-poverty activist and a former welfare recipient herself. She told us about the stigmas that accompanies socioeconomic deprivation. This was one of the interviews very early on in the trip that really stayed with me. Cooper, who used to be a truancy officer in the Cleveland School Board, said in her interview, poverty is not just that you are cash poor, you're also culture poor, morally poor, something must be wrong with you. It destroys a person that's poor, but it also destroys a person who assumes that because they have something the poor do not, it destroys their character as well, end quote. In a city where half of all Black women are impoverished, Cooper noted that the very poor of Cleveland are doing, quote, the same thing they were doing in slavery. It was a sobering reminder for the three of us as we traveled through the Rust Belt that issues of income inequality and the financial prospects that an American has is inextricably tied to race and gender. Back to you, Loren.
Thanks, Dan. After interviews in Buffalo and Elmira, we spent almost a week in New York City. Given the recent attacks on Asian Americans and the passage by states of laws targeting young transgender Americans, it's hard for me to forget the words of Dr. Larry Mass in 2011, before the rise of Donald Trump. After recalling the World War II genocide of 6 million Jews, Mass said, "There's that famous saying of Santayana, those who don't learn the lesson of history are condemned to repeat them. I've created an addendum to that," Mass said. "They will repeat them even if they've learned history, so long as they think they can get away with it." History can turn on a dime, Mass continued. He insisted a Hitler-style demagogue could foment public targeting of African Americans, Muslim Americans, gays, any group of people. It doesn't have to be Jews, Mass said. When the public starts going crazy, when the public starts that fever of bondedness about something, rationality drops away and the mass psychology of fascism takes over. Mass's description of inhuman human behavior recalled Twain's maxim that man is the only animal that blushes or needs to. Hartford, Twain's home for longer than any other place from 1871 to 1891, provided us a tale of two cities. Twain's mansion represented an elegant, affluent, older Hartford, but Hartford was also one of America's poorest cities. After an afternoon-long tour of Hartford neighborhoods, Andrew Walsh of Trinity College told us that Hartford's future depended on the contribution and economic impact of immigrants and the education of their children. Quote, "If we succeed in raising educational levels, Hartford will continue to do very well," he said. "If we don't, Hartford will have real troubles." We also interviewed Ingrid Mattson, then the director of Hartford Seminary's McDonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian Muslim Relations. Dan, will you talk about Mattson and what she had to say?
Yeah, sure. One of Loren's catchphrases that is that he's always looking for ways to diminish his ignorance. And back then when we did this road trip, I was 20 years old and I had naive perceptions of the world. And I was confronted with my own ignorance when we met Ingrid Mattson. It's an ignorance that's shared by other Americans and echoed in Twain's time as well. Many Americans viewed Islam as an anti-Christian faith, one that's incompatible with the West. In Innocents Abroad, a young Mark Twain portrayed Muslim leaders as bloodthirsty savages, and he wrote that their, quote, "natural instincts do not permit them to be moral." Ingrid Mattson, whom the New York Times called perhaps the most noticed figure among American Muslim women, headed up the Islamic Society of North America and shared her journey of conversion to the faith. Regarding the burden placed on Muslims in the wake of 9/11 to purge radical terrorism from the faith, Mattson said, "We would love to, but we are not in control of those people. More Muslims have been killed by ISIS than non-Muslims." She went on to explain that Islam doesn't have a hierarchical structure. There's no equivalent of a pope, and that American Muslims feel as threatened as non-Muslim Americans by cult-like terrorists. I'd realized that I had brought preconceived notions to this interview, that it speaks more to my ignorance than anything else, that I was so struck by Mattson's joviality and candor when we spoke with her. It was an aha moment for me that the history of the US is defined by a paradigm of us versus them, scapegoating and excluding whole groups of people in order to tout our way as the best way. Back to you, Loren.
Thanks, Dan. After Hartford and Boston, we headed south. Lexington, once the capital of Kentucky's slave trade, was our first city in the South. It was the birthplace of Twain's mother, Jane Langston, who married John Marshall Clemens in 1823, and with him owned 6 slaves. In Lexington, Alyssa interviewed Merlyn Davis. Alyssa?
At the time we interviewed her, Merlyn Davis was a columnist at the Lexington Herald-Leader, and she used her column to candidly address issues of race. Davis was one of several women we spoke to during the trip who integrated a school as a child. She had skipped the 5th grade, she told us, not because she could, but because she had to. She was one of the few Black students to integrate an elementary school in Owensboro, Kentucky. She said, quote, "We all ended up in 6th grade because as far as I could tell, Mrs. Olive Bopp was the only teacher in the school that would take us," she said. "So I have no idea what the 5th grade's like." Davis had a warm, gregarious personality, but she was not optimistic about overcoming prejudice in America, and she was particularly critical of the reputation of the outward Southern hospitality versus how people acted behind closed doors. She said, "I just don't see it as improving. I see it as changing. We just got to step on somebody to make ourselves taller, and I don't know why." Merlyn Davis revealed a chilling story later, one that we had not heard the first time that we interviewed her. Because of the public facing nature of her column, she had received many threats over the years, but there was one that went a step further and violently threatened her daughter. The letter writer said he knew where her school was located and that it was time that her daughter became a woman. So, at the urging of her editor, Davis took this to police. But when a white officer showed up to her house, instead of offering help, he told her, "You know, I've been mad at you enough times to say something similar." Loren, back to you.
Thanks, Alyssa. After going far south as New Orleans, we headed north and west. In Kansas, at the Kickapoo Reservation, Curtis Simon Sr., a member of the tribal council, took us to the Kickapoo Nation School, a K through 12 school with 91 students. That was a response to the US and church-sponsored boarding schools for Native students of an earlier era. Those schools forced assimilation, erased Native culture, suppressed tribal languages, cut off the braids of children, assigned them non-Native names, and rejected Native religious beliefs. Twain never wrote about the Kickapoo, but he called the warrior who headed the Washos of Nevada a demeaning name that sounded a bit like Kickapoo, Hoop-de-doodle-doo. Twain said Hoop-de-doodle-doo shed giant vermin and smelled like a stink pot, thereby perpetuating the stereotype of the subhuman American Indian. We drove on to Salt Lake City, Dan's hometown, where Dan interviewed Troy Williams. Dan?
Thanks, Loren. I knew when we arrived in my hometown that we would need to speak with Troy Williams, who's unofficially designated as the gay mayor of Salt Lake. Back then, he was the host of a local radio show about grassroots activism, and today he's the executive director of Equality Utah, which is an LGBT advocacy organization. As a former Mormon himself, much of Williams' activism was centered around fighting the homophobia that's deeply entrenched in the LDS Church. I remember back in July 2009, my last summer in Utah before starting college in Northwestern, when a gay couple was arrested after one kissed the other on the cheek near the Mormon temple in downtown Salt Lake. The whole incident was caught on camera. Williams was outraged when he heard the news. So inspired by the sit-ins of the civil rights movement, he organized 3 so-called kiss-ins at the exact plaza where the gay couple was handcuffed. The rallies he led, attended by both gay and straight couples, lips locked in protest, were aimed at calling out the Mormon Church. For all the differences the Mormons have with the LGBT community and vice versa, Williams said that the two groups have a lot more in common than people would believe. Quote, "Mormons and queer people know what it's like to be hated for being different," he said, "so they ought to have empathy." The Mormons were radical communitarians who practiced a different marital form, aka polygamy. They fled the US in the mid-1800s and settled in the Salt Lake Valley, ensconced in the Rocky Mountains and flanked by desert. When the Utah Territory was incorporated in the United States in 1896, the Mormons felt a tremendous need to assimilate and prove that they were just regular Americans. Williams said that marginalized groups and persecuted groups tend to show that they've assimilated as good, worthy Americans by finding another group and ostracizing them. Quote, "They forget their own history of oppression and start to contribute to the oppression of others. That's what the Latter-day Saints have done," end quote. Since our interview, Williams said a lot of progress has been made in Utah, citing a long-awaited hate crimes law that passed in 2019 and the banning of gay conversion therapy in January 2020. Back to you.
Thanks, Dan. We stopped in Virginia City, Nevada, where Twain reported for the Territorial Enterprise, and we played bank robbers and barmaid. Twain wrote about a local parade in which whites were followed by African Americans in order of blackness. light to dark. Quote, "It was a fine stroke of strategy," Twain wrote. "The day was dusty and onlookers could not tell where the white marchers left off and the black ones began. Mocking whites' belief in their racial superiority, Twain questioned the wisdom of whites being on bad terms with blacks. Quote, "They have got to sing with them in heaven or scorch with them in hell, someday in the most familiar and sociable ways and on a footing of most perfect equality." I wanted our visit to San Francisco to help us learn more about the people there who are often disparaged. The Chinese immigrants who entered the United States through San Francisco Bay's Angel Island, and the Native Americans who were called diggers because they supposedly searched for wild roots. Was the similarity between the word digger and the country's most potent racial epithet, nigger, mere coincidence? In San Francisco Bay, Angel Island provided a great place to learn about the impact on the Chinese. The Angel Island Immigration Station expelled many Chinese on the basis of race, class, and gender. 200 Chinese were stuffed into a 1,000 square foot room. 3 high bunk beds were stripped of the mattresses provided to other immigrants. With the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 in force, many Chinese immigrants lied about their identity, pretending to be the children of Chinese merchants or US citizens. They lived in constant fear of detection and deportation. That life of fear was captured in the Chinese calligraphy on the immigration station's walls. And the example you're seeing, I believe, says, "Sadness kills the person in the wooden building." Angel Island reminded me of an evolution in Twain's attitudes toward Chinese Americans and other people of color. He grew wiser and more empathetic as he aged. Writing from the Hawaiian Islands, he had approved of the exploitation of indentured Chinese laborers. He recommended $5 a month, quote, coolies for California. But later, he outspokenly opposed the mistreatment of the Chinese in California. He claimed he was fired by the San Francisco Daily Morning Call because of his indignant piece about street bullies abusing peaceful Chinese. Indigenous people had been in the San Francisco area for more than 10,000 years. The cemetery of Mission Dolores, founded by Spanish priests in 1776, reminded us that in an earlier era, the Spanish missions not only forced conversion to obliterate the local Indians' names, languages, and culture, but also helped decimate the area's Native Americans. Vincent Medina, a 27-year-old assistant curator of the mission and a member of the Chochenyo Ohlone community, said Spanish priests such as Junipero Serra, founder of the California missions, who was given sainthood by Pope Francis in 2015, saw the missions as utopian Christian communities to help the Indians and save their souls. In reality, the missions were, Medina said, quote, horrible places similar to concentration camps. Once baptized, Indians were held against their will. They were treated as slaves, their land taken, their labor exploited. A detachment of soldiers shackled and whipped those who tried to flee. Unmarried Indian women were forced to work as spinners and weavers when they were not being driven into the mission for mass or lessons in church doctrine. By 1843, Mission Dolores' total Indian population of at least 1,000 had been reduced to, quote, 8 aged starvelings. That experience drove Medina to work at Mission Dolores, where he offered an Indian Native American perspective on the history of the missions. Medina also committed to a larger challenge to change the way the story of the missions was told and taught throughout California in a 4th grade unit on the missions. Some mission curators resisted, but he helped the California Indian Culture and Sovereignty Center develop a website about Indian opposition to the missions. He is determined, he said, to make concrete changes happen. Alyssa, would you please recount our encounter in San Francisco with smash and grabbers and apparently the one item they took from your suitcase? They did not. Yeah, they took your suitcase, sorry.
Yes, we fell upon a bit of hardship in San Francisco when we returned to our minivan one evening to find glass glittering on the sidewalk and a shattered window. So smash and grabbers had taken our video camera, 2 laptop computers, my 2 suitcases. We lost videos, photos, notes. We were devastated. But the next morning at the auto body shop, as we were repairing our window, I received a tweet from someone named Kimberly Kills asking where I was. I don't normally respond to strangers, but this seemed more than a coincidence. And it turns out that she had found one of my suitcases late at night on a sidewalk in Oakland. And she asked if I meant to leave it there. And I was like, oh my God, no. So we arranged to meet at a Starbucks, and the story got a bit more layered as Kills had something personal to say about the identity issues that were the focus of our trip. She described herself as a transgender model who performed in adult films, and she labeled her sexual orientation as polyamorous bisexual. She'd been the child of divorced parents, and when she was about 2, and she grew up a military brat who moved across the country every 2 years or so from town to town. So we are very grateful to have heard her story and that she found my suitcase. It turns out, Loren, as you had mentioned, that the only missing item of note was my biography of Mark Twain. No doubt our robbers wanted to read about Twain's time in San Francisco, which he called, quote, the most cordial and sociable city, perhaps so they could learn how to be even more hospitable to out-of-towners.
Thanks, Alyssa. I wanted our trip to end in Seattle because my Ghiglione great-grandparents, after coming from northern Italian villages to New York City in the 1870s, moved to Seattle around 1900. One purpose of our trip was to explore the identity of immigrants, especially Italian Americans. They were exploited as strikebreakers in US coal fields, lynched by Louisiana mobs in the 1890s, and regularly vilified by nativist bigots as biologically inferior anarchists. A 1906 Washington Post editorial said 90% of arriving Italians were, quote, the degenerate spawn of Asiatic hordes, traveling to America to cut throats, throw dynamite, and conduct labor riots and assassinations. I focused on my own family, beginning with the arrival from Puntedecimo, Italy, in 1872 of my great-grandfather, Angelo Francesco Ghiglione, a barely literate indentured pasta maker, shown here during his New York City days. Eventually, he would run his own pasta company, A.F. Ghiglione and Sons, in New York and then Seattle. As much as I revered the entrepreneurial spirit of my great-grandfather, I especially admired the contributions of his son, Dr. August J. Ghiglione, a Columbia University grad who cared for Seattle's Italian Americans from 1905 until his death in 1949 and served them as Italian consul for the Pacific Northwest from 1907 to 1914. Here he is in the center of this picture with a mask on and his nose sticking out prominently. When a Seattle Times reader disparaged Italian, Chinese, and Japanese immigrants in 1910, Dr. Ghiglione attacked the reader's ignorance and misinformation. He defended immigrants' patriotism and dismissed the reader's call for immigration restriction as amounting to air bubbles. In response to the reader's claim that Italians were violent criminals, Dr. Ghiglione cited a study of Italians in America that concluded, generally speaking, they are gentle drudges, honest, faithful, and inoffensive. He foresaw an America enriched and enlivened for generations to come by its immigrants, by people of different races, ethnicities, religions, and visions of what life in the United States could be. Dr. Ghiglione's celebration of immigrants is the perfect prelude to our trip's last interview. Vietnamese refugees, like Italian, Chinese, and other immigrants before them, face dehumanizing discrimination. Only 36% of Americans wanted to accept Vietnamese refugees in 1975 when the Vietnam War ended. But 875,000 Vietnamese refugees came anyway. Today, at a time when Asian Americans are being subjected by other Americans to verbal and physical violence, including murder, what better time to tell the story of Julie Pham and Giuseppe Anthony Tran? It reminds us that in general, refugees and immigrants do not repudiate, but instead reinforce American values. Dan?
I was inspired by Loren's passion for roots research, seeking out every Ghiglione in the United States. So whenever we had the chance, I suggested that we interview Vietnamese Americans whom we met in Chicago, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Seattle. It was a personal motivation to understand the experiences of my parents when they were refugees, trying to fit into a new country. Two of the interviews in particular stood out to me. Giuseppe Anthony Tran shared his epic story of escaping Vietnam 6 years after the end of the war on a raft with a dozen other desperate Vietnamese. He recounts the conditions of the refugee camp in Thailand, his adoption by an Italian American couple in Chicago. He called himself, quote, an Italian Vietnamese living in America, and his eventual home in New Orleans, where he found kinship and community with the Vietnamese who lived there. Today, he's the parish coordinator for the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church, and said that in New Orleans, the Vietnamese community commemorated the 4 decades since the end of the Vietnam War a little differently. Quote, everywhere else they were mourning. Here, we celebrated 40 years of success, evaluating ourselves and seeing what we've done. The other standout interview for me was with Julie Pham, the managing editor of Người Việt Tây Bắc, the largest and oldest newspaper for Vietnamese immigrants in the US. The Seattleite said, quote, people are really hungry to feel connected. The Vietnamese community is the most linguistically isolated with the highest percentage of limited English proficiency. The newspaper links people with news of their homeland, Vietnam, and also with local news so they can understand their new homeland as well. As a Vietnamese American myself, meeting people like Julie and Giuseppe helped me understand some of the hallmarks of the immigrant and refugee experience, which is something that many Americans can relate to. Thanks, Loren.
Thanks, Dan. I'm sorry this presentation doesn't permit those of you viewing it to ask questions of us, but Alyssa, Dan, and I hope you'll have an opportunity to read Genus Americanus, our book, especially the last 2 chapters. They outline the conclusions from our 3-month road trip and our reasons for believing that younger generations of Americans will address the identity issues our interviews highlight. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.